Good evening, everybody. This is UFOs. You can see from the subtitle, I'm asking the question, are there any images that need an extraterrestrial explanation? As some people believe the answer is yes. So I'm not talking about reports of alien abductions. I'm talking about looking at images, because that's part of the research that I did at the University of Liverpool. I spent a lot of my years there looking at images, image analysis, image processing. And that's one of the things that got me interested in looking at UFOs. But we can start by asking about statistics. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but when a survey was carried out in America some years ago and youngsters were asked, have extraterrestrial aliens visited the Earth? The answer was an astonishing 40% said either yes or maybe or I'm not too sure. Admittedly, this is an old survey, 2018, and admittedly this is American, and I would love to know whether or not for Europe or the UK, whether that number is any different. But not only have extraterrestrials visited, perhaps in the far past, maybe they built the pyramids, who knows? If you ask the question, are extraterrestrial aliens visiting now? Are aliens walking amongst us? You would assume the answer would be a smaller number than 40%. Well, it is, but not by much. So this tells you something either about aliens or about Americans, depending on which way you want to look at it. 35% is less than the number who believe in ghosts. But rather worryingly, it's rather larger than the number who believe in telekinesis. And it's larger than the number who believe in Bigfoot. And most worrying of all, it is larger than the number of people who believe in evolution. Yeah, take what you will from that set of statistics. But I like this graph, which was published quite a few years ago now. It shows the percentage of, in this case, the US population that carry cameras everywhere they go, every waking moment of their lives, which apparently was almost zero until the invention of the smartphone. And now everybody has got a camera on them. And so you could argue that with very little fanfare, we've now answered all these questions about Bigfoot or flying saucers or ghosts or anything, because if we've all got cameras on us, then surely if these things actually existed, they would have been photographed and we would have nailed this problem. It's only really speculation when nobody has got a camera when they see Nessie in Loch Ness or when they see a flying saucer, etc. So you could say, why are we still arguing about whether UFOs exist or not? Well, no, it's not settled, because I tried a few years ago Googling UFOs to find how many web pages still discuss the concept of unidentified flying objects. And I got about 250 million web pages. I didn't look at them all, admittedly, but you could argue that no, this issue is not settled, because a lot of people apparently around the world still believe that this is an open question. So this evening, I'm going to claim that UFOs, or UFO images in particular, could fall into a number of categories, 4 basic categories. And the categories are, they could be man-made objects that have misidentified. They could be natural objects that have been misidentified. In many cases, they are actually not actually physical objects out there. They are just artifacts of the process of taking a camera image. And of course, there's always the possibility that they are deliberately faked because somebody is trying to fool us. And the elephant in the room is, well, actually, there is a 5th possibility. And the 5th possibility is that they are, in fact, extraterrestrial spacecraft and aliens are visiting us. So I'm going to look at a number of possibilities, and I'm going to use a particular scientific principle to ask the question, well, is it more likely that they are extraterrestrial spacecraft, or is it more likely that they are something more mundane? Let's first just make sure that we're all on the same page regarding definitions. I conform to the usual definition, if you like, the conventional usage of the acronym UFO or UFO to mean an object observed in the sky, usually at night, but sometimes during the day, that is not readily identified. So we're not talking about birds for whom you don't know the species. These are objects that we are not sure what it is we're looking at. And regarding extraterrestrial origin, I quite definitely side with Carl Sagan, who said many years ago, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you are going to say this object in the sky is an extraterrestrial, that evidence, that proof has to be absolutely rock solid. And generally speaking, that rock solid evidence is often lacking. A useful tool for the rational scientist, and I regard myself as relatively rational as scientists go, Occam's razor. You may not have heard of this, but you've possibly seen it paraphrased. If there are two possible explanations for the same thing, then the one that requires the least speculation is preferred. It's usually the better of the two. And it's often paraphrased as simply, simpler solutions are more likely to be correct than complex ones. So if one option is this might be extraterrestrial, but there happens to be a much simpler explanation, well, we can't tell which one's right, but it's probable that the simpler explanation is more likely to be correct. So where do we find reliable information about UFOs? Well, there's lots of reliable places, especially in America, where you can go to UFO information centers. You can tell it's reliable because of the little green man on the porch there, who will give you information if you ask. And there are various UFO hotspots, of course, in America, where there seem to be, for some reason or another, an awful lot of UFO sightings. Life would be so much easier if UFO images were like this. Absolutely clear, detailed, in focus from the person who took the picture. No camera shake, no movement of the camera making the image look blurred. Well exposed so we can see basically the contrast, the detail, etc. If we got lots and lots of images like this, we would be fairly sure that these things are real and flying through our skies. But that's not what most UFO images look like. 99% of the UFO images you can find by trawling through books and magazines and the internet, almost universally UFO images look like that. They're blurred, they're out of focus. There is almost certainly camera movement. They're usually overexposed. If they're taken at night, they are almost universally overexposed. And you might say, well, I'm not sure what that is. Let's make it bigger. Well, that doesn't help. Making it bigger changes a small blurry object into a big blurry object. And I have got no idea whatsoever what that is, for a number of different reasons. A, I can't tell, but B, if it's an image taken more than a few years ago, with digital cameras record the time and the date and the location where the image was taken. But good old-fashioned analog images didn't. If it was taken on film, then we've got no idea who took it, when it was taken, where it was taken, what camera, what lens, what aperture, what shutter speed, which way were they pointing. We have got no idea of the context. These days we call it metadata. There's no associated data with this image that helps us understand the context. And if we don't understand the context, then we've got no chance of actually interpreting what this particular blob happens to be. And that's one of the basic problems with looking at UFO images. If we don't understand the context, the image itself is almost meaningless. I wondered what the first UFO images were, and I saw this image of hieroglyphs that clearly show an Apache helicopter in the top left, and Luke Skywalker's speeder in the top right, and a Zeppelin a little bit below that. When I first saw this, I thought, oh, somebody has just been playing around with Photoshop. But no, that is a genuine bit of a wall in Egypt. I'm not sure if that came into any of your discussions earlier, but no, that is a real wall in Egypt. And you look at that and you think, what on earth were they chiseling into this wall? What must they have seen? But all you need is a little bit of explanation, and the explanation is, well, actually, it's two sets of hieroglyphs, Two pharaohs, Seti I and Ramses II, basically chiseled their own hieroglyphs into the same wall. Bit like reusing a piece of paper and putting it through a printer twice, you end up with two sets. And when you start superimposing those, I'll put them in color, now you see the two sets of hieroglyphs in different colors. You can see that, well, okay, the Apache helicopter has now disappeared, and it's only our interpretation of what we were looking at that gave us that impression that we were looking at something rather extraterrestrial when we look at this Zeppelin or land speeder or these other shapes. So again, we have to be careful. Even if we absolutely know the image we're looking at is genuine, we still have to understand something of how that image was produced. So let's have a look at the various categories. UFOs might be man-made objects. And if you happen to live next door to a US Air Force base where super secret aircraft are always taking off and landing, you will often see mysterious lights in the sky that can't be explained. Just to make it easier for you, the US Air Force has given you this identification chart. Now, you might think that some of these are presumably the latest, very stealthy, very secret US fighters or US bombers. But no, in fact, the first one is a weather balloon, the second one is a weather balloon, the third one is a weather balloon, the fourth one is a weather balloon, the fifth one is a weather balloon. Any idea what the next one is? No, swamp gas. Then we have a weather balloon, 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 and a weather balloon. So that makes it easier for us to identify. Now, of course, we know that there will be all sorts of goings-on around US Air Force bases and various other military sites where they are developing the very latest aircraft. And of course, there will be interesting sightings, including aircraft flying really fast, because we're not sure exactly what the US military, or indeed any military, is actually up to behind closed doors or barbed wire fences. So that's just a little bit of fun. But have a look at this. I'm not, again, going to ask for a show of hands necessarily, but you can ask yourself, what is it we're looking at? Apart from the fact that we've got, I think, a tree coming into the left-hand side, and I think a leaf coming in at the top. Is this a long exposure of a fleet of UFOs heading off into the distance? If not, what is it that we're actually looking at? Perhaps I will just pause for a few seconds. Does anybody know what it actually is we're looking at? We've got a number of different options there. Some people in the past have said commercial aircraft. They don't fly like this. Some said...
We saw exactly that out of here.
Yeah?
Yeah, which is reflected the ceiling lights on the...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, very close, very close. This is not actually a reflection, but that's a lot closer than military aircraft or commercial aircraft, which don't fly like this. This was actually taken on a very misty day, and if I tell you where I got the photo from, you'll know instantly what it is. I got this photo from Pylon of the Month, December 2019. This is taken on a misty day. And you can't see the pylon. But if I put the pylon in where I think the pylon ought to be, we're not looking at a long exposure of a lot of moving objects. It's a snapshot. And all we're looking at is basically ice that has formed on the cables that are going to that pylon. It's a misty night, so we can't see the pylon itself. And the ice is simply reflecting light from presumably a light source just over the horizon. So here I've deliberately tried to mislead you by saying, is it a long exposure? And if it's a long exposure, you tend to think of objects moving. But actually it's not. It's actually a snapshot. And again, it's the context that's important. If you knew the exposure, if you knew the conditions under which the picture was taken, you'd find it a lot easier to interpret what it was you were looking at. And yes, Pylon of the Month is a real thing, by the way. Yes. I'm not going to log on now, but when you get home, go and check www Pylon of the Month. These are not sad people. These are real people who go around the country photographing pylons. As to why, that's a different question altogether. And of course, there are various interesting objects in the sky where you think, wow, what on earth is that? Turns out it's just a rocket launch. this is getting more and more common, not so much in the UK, but in America, it is getting very common to actually find rockets that are launched at sunset tend to catch the rays of the dying sun, and you get the rocket itself producing a whole load of exhaust trail, as it were, and therefore you get some rather odd reflections. So yes, it would be totally understandable, unless you knew that Elon Musk was putting up rockets like this almost daily, it would be almost impossible to realize that this is not a UFO. Some of these things are spectacular in their own right. It's a shame that what we're really looking at is pollution, because the rocket is going up and leaving a trail. So although they look interesting, I still don't entirely agree that we should be sending up quite so many rockets and satellites. And sometimes the rocket trails themselves can look rather spectacular. In this particular case, again, it's just catching the dying rays of the sun. The sun is catching the rocket exhaust. The atmosphere is moving, lots of winds at different altitudes at different speeds, and some of the rocket fuel that's left in the trail there is iridescent, so you get these colors coming through from the sun. So very interesting, but if you know what you're looking at, nobody would confuse that with a UFO. But again, anybody who saw this in the sky would possibly say to themselves, well, this is definitely an invasion. We are quite definitely seeing a whole load of UFOs coming in. We've got odd-looking things moving. Again, this is an exposure of quite a few minutes, so something is moving down there, and we have different colored blobs at different heights. This looks extremely alien. And yes, it is alien unless you know what scientists tend to get up to. And scientists sometimes send gases into the upper atmosphere, especially if you want to know how the upper atmosphere is behaving. You send up sounding rockets, you release gas, which then fluoresces in the dying rays of the sun, and different gases fluoresce in different colors. And if you watch what happens to these gases, you can see how the atmosphere, especially many, many tens of kilometers up, is moving and changing. And you get a better understanding of the way our atmosphere is constructed, and you get a better idea of why we get an aurora borealis or an aurora australis, which is a function of the particles from the sun exciting some of these atoms in the upper atmosphere. So this is simply a scientific experiment. But if you didn't know it was happening and you saw these lights in the sky, you'd be forgiven to think something odd is happening. Every once in a while, I put this reference at the bottom here. APOD simply means Astronomy Picture of the Day. APOD is a NASA webpage where every day they have an interesting astronomical image, whether it be the latest galaxy imaged by a telescope or more earthbound experiments. It used to be that we would be fooled by a whole load of lights in the sky like this. But these days, we are getting so used to the idea that whenever we see a lot of lights dancing in the sky, none of us these days would say, oh, that's obviously an extraterrestrial invasion. We would simply say, oh, yeah, another drone show, yeah. These days, of course, in the past, the choreography of the drones was rather poor. Now the choreography is so good, you can generate almost anything you like. For instance, for the King's coronation, we had these drone displays in London, and the precision with which you can send up a drone with a light on it is such that you can generate, in a sense, any picture you like in the sky. So that's no longer quite the mystery that it used to be some decades earlier. Some people have said, I don't know that I've seen UFOs, but I've seen their landing pads. There's 3 landing pads that I can see in the desert. All you really have to do if you see anything out of an aircraft window is make a note of the time, and if you know where you've come from and where you're going, you can pretty much work out where over the Earth you are, even if it doesn't actually say so on the seat back in front of you, highlighting this particular state you're overflying. And as soon as you know where it is that you are, you can simply use Google Earth or something like that to find out what are these peculiar triangular structures in the middle of the desert. Is this something that the US military is trying to hide? Well, not really. It's just a solar plant. Basically, a lot of mirrors that are reflecting sunlight to this point here, either to generate very high temperatures for melting materials or to generate power. If you look at these collections of mirrors, depending on the angle that you are looking at the mirrors compared to the angle of the sun, sometimes you can get these odd reflection effects. So you get this odd effect. Even though the collection of mirrors is large and circular, it can still give you odd effects when you're looking at them from a few miles altitude. So not UFO landing pads. When I wrote this talk, I intended it to be restricted only to looking at images, because that's one of my interests. But inevitably, as soon as you get onto the internet, you start to get diverted into other things. And I picked up a couple of videos. This was one in which I've taken off the narration because the annoying person with the camera is shouting how amazing this is that they're seeing a cigar-shaped UFO floating over the lake. And this particular video went viral. I can't remember how many people watched this video, probably quite a few million, I would imagine. But it's an example of a situation in which somebody sees something that they can't readily identify. They call it a UFO, they stick it on social media, and millions of people then basically copy it and repost it or retweet it, as it was at the time, even after the explanation has been posted. Within hours of this thing going onto the internet, the explanation was there, but that didn't stop a whole load of people saying, I'm going to ignore the explanation, I'm going to repost it as a UFO sighting. So what is this cigar-shaped object floating over the lake, rather magically? Well, it's the Goodyear blimp. There's a football stadium on the other side of the lake. Of course the Goodyear blimp is going to be there. And they almost immediately said, basically, don't want to get in the way of a good story, but that is definitely us. I'm sorry, it is definitely us. Despite the explanation being there, people still like the idea of reposting mysteries, even though there is no longer mystery. And that's what gets UFO sightings exaggerated and passed on from person to person. But when I saw that one, I then saw, you know what it's like with YouTube. You might also like this. Oh, yeah. Somebody basically said, I have super clear footage of a UFO. I thought, fantastic. Not any of these blurry, difficult to work out what the hell's going on sort of videos. We now have a super clear footage of a UFO. I thought, this is definitely worth a watch. So I had a look at it. You get the impression this is a video camera on full zoom and the person is having difficulty holding it steady. But to their credit, after a minute or two, they finally got it steadier. And eventually they perhaps leant against a wall to try and steady it as much as possible. And eventually they got a clear image. And now we can see exactly what it is. It's a Mylar balloon. So young Johnny or Jenny or someone had a birthday party, had a Mylar balloon in the shape of a letter J. It got loose, floated off into the atmosphere. Mylar will reflect sunlight, and even miles away, you can still catch the glint of a Mylar balloon, which is why they are quite often candidates for UFOs. But I couldn't help myself with the next one, because after the super clear footage, I saw this particular statement. So ignore this is just for context. Puerto Rico, proximity to the Bermuda Triangle may explain why it's a hotbed of UFOs. This is what got me interested. There have been countless UFO sightings over the years, but many experts, I'm not sure who these experts are, but many experts consider this next video to be the gold standard of UFOs. So I thought, well, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life looking at UFO videos on YouTube, but if this one is considered to be the gold standard, then I at least should look at that one to see whether or not there's a simple explanation for what it is they're looking at. So it is high quality. It has the advantage that it's a relatively high quality video. It has the advantage that it's a long video. It's not just 10 seconds, it's actually quite a few minutes. It was taken by the US Customs and Border Control aircraft with an infrared camera. The US are quite keen on seeing what's coming into their country, and they have a lot of very high-tech toys to make sure that they can see people and contraband coming into the country. So this is a very expensive, high-tech infrared camera on an aircraft. Let's just run the video. So there's this UFO going hell for leather. It's infrared, dark means warm, light means cold. So there's a warm object flying hell for leather from, what is it, right to left in this particular case. Over quite a few minutes, it seems to be traveling over fields. It seems to be occasionally traveling, there's a lake by the looks of it. It travels over houses. It seems to move slightly, perhaps it rotates. It's flying along and it goes over, what's that, an industrial estate perhaps? And then it crosses over the taxiway of an airport, and then it crosses over the runway of an airport. And it's often said that UFOs, they like to be around military bases and airports. It is said, it is claimed. So what I found interesting about this is not only the fact that it's quite long, so you get a nice long run. There seem to be cars on the road there in the background. What I found most useful is all of the metadata. All of the context is there. Because not only do we get an interesting idea of what's in the background, we also have this very useful data. We don't have to worry about all of the numbers in this head-up display, as it were, but this ACFT is aircraft. That is the longitude and latitude of the aircraft. You know exactly where the aircraft is. Every video frame for those 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 4 minutes, we know exactly where the aircraft was. And we know where the camera was looking. The camera is gimbaled under the aircraft, and a computer knows exactly where the camera is pointing. And it knows the height of the aircraft and the speed of the aircraft and the location of the aircraft and the angle of the camera. Therefore, it knows exactly where the camera is pointing. And on the right-hand side, TGT, target, that is the location behind that cross. The UFO isn't always in the cross, but obviously it's relatively close. The target, the latitude and longitude of the chunk of ground directly behind the UFO. So we've got a lot of really useful information about what's going on in this particular situation. The UFO flew, you possibly didn't catch it, it flew over a field and there's lots of these dark objects in the background. Dark, remember, is warm, light is cold. So these are fairly largish objects that seem to be standing in a field. I'm guessing they're cows. I think they're a little bit too big for sheep, so I think they're cows. So the object we're looking at is about the same temperature as a cow and probably a bit smaller than a cow. And when we look at it over a bit of an industrial area, there's cars on the road there where cars are dark at one end and light at the other because the engine is warm and the rest of the car isn't quite so warm. Let's take those coordinates and work out where we are. I took frame by frame the video and then I plotted it on a map of, in this case, Puerto Rico, because that's where the aircraft was flying. It's flying over this particular airport. Let's just dim those colors down a bit. There's the scale, just so you can get an idea of what we're talking about. 1 kilometer here, and those blue dots, I think every 10 seconds or so, I plotted where does the camera think the UFO is. Remember, it's not necessarily the UFO itself, it's the area of ground immediately behind the UFO, as it apparently goes hell for leather in that direction from southwest to northeast. The people who posted this UFO said, this is amazing because the wind is blowing in the opposite direction. On this particular day, there was a moderate breeze of 18 miles an hour towards the southwest, and yet this object is flying towards the northeast. How can an object that isn't actually propelled possibly be flying into a headwind, they say? Okay, let's put that to one side for a moment and ask ourselves, where's the aircraft? So in red, I've plotted out the aircraft at the same points as the UFO itself. Notice the aircraft is flying quite smoothly. It's flying in a slight curve, looking down, as it were, in the bottom left at the UFO. I took a number of different frames and I asked myself, how is the UFO actually moving? For instance, in the video frame where the aircraft was there, the UFO was there. That doesn't mean the UFO is where the blue dot is. It means the UFO is somewhere along the grey line between where the aircraft is and the point on the ground that it's seeing the UFO. So the UFO is somewhere on that grey line. Where is it? I don't know, 20 seconds later. It's somewhere on that grey line. Where is it 20 seconds later? It's somewhere on that grey line. Where is it 20 seconds later? You can already see what's going on here. You can say to yourself, either the UFO is traveling towards the northeast at this amazing speed of a few hundred miles an hour, or you can say to yourself, well, it looks like all of these grey lines actually intersect at the same place. Is it possible that we're actually seeing an object that is not moving at all? Does it only appear to be moving hell for leather to the left because the aircraft is traveling hell for leather to the right? And of course, things will appear to move if you've got a static object and you're moving, you're looking at that static object, of course it will appear to move relative to the background. I continued this just out of interest and followed it a little bit further. It's amazing that this infrared camera, even though it's many kilometers away, could still see this small object because it's infrared, because it's a heat signature. And I found that that black object appeared to move ever so slightly in that direction over a period of a few minutes. Remember which way the wind's blowing? So, what are we actually looking at? Are we looking at an extraterrestrial spacecraft? The blurb that accompanied this particular video said, what we're looking at is a metallic orb moving at incredible speed with no obvious propulsion into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind. And it finished with this comment, the infrared camera sees an object that does not match anything we know of. These experts were completely dumbfounded by this extraterrestrial craft. How they determined it's a metallic orb, I don't know, because there's nothing in that video that tells you, A, it's metallic, or B, it's an orb. It's just a blob. That's all you can tell. Moving at incredible speed. Well, no, I don't think it is moving at incredible speed. No obvious propulsion. Well, I sort of agree with that. It's got no wings, it's got no engines, there's no real obvious propulsion. But no, it's not moving into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind, it's actually going downwind. And does not match anything we know of. Who are these experts who can't figure out what it is they're actually looking at? Occam's razor, there's a very complex explanation, an extraterrestrial spacecraft with really amazing characteristics. Alternatively, you could say the video is entirely consistent with the fact that what you're looking at is an object that is essentially static. If anything, maybe it's drifting very slowly downwind. It's probably a balloon. This is, quote, the gold standard of UFO videos that some people claim is undeniable proof that UFOs exist and that they are extraterrestrial. I would argue, no, it's not. And if we revisit this, no obvious propulsion, well, actually, now we figure that it's drifting downwind. Well, yes, there is an obvious propulsion. It's drifting on the breeze. So Occam's razor says a really complicated explanation, a really simple explanation. I would always go with the simple one. Let's think about natural objects rather than man-made objects. You've seen Pylon of the Month. Now we're going with Cloud of the Month. And yes, this is a real thing. Again, the Cloud Appreciation Society produce a Cloud of the Month. And there's been very interesting clouds published month by month. This was an interesting one, a large circular set of blobs. It's probably the result of an aircraft disturbing the cloud as it flew through the cloud, but you can't see the aircraft. And sometimes you get big holes, a sort of a hole punched into the cloud. It looks like a flying saucer has just come through the cloud deck and left a big hole there. But no, this is a perfectly reasonably well understood meteorological phenomena. I'm not going to go through that. I quite like that central image because it looks like the opening sequence from Independence Day or something. But no, it's just another thundercloud. And sometimes you can get some really lovely lenticular clouds forming, especially over mountain ranges. In this particular case, not a mountain range, but an isolated mountain of Mount Fuji. Even though nature produces some fairly spectacular clouds, that doesn't stop people taking images like this and augmenting them in Photoshop and basically saying, well, we can make it even better. No, let nature do its thing. Don't bother trying to make it even better. And sometimes you get rather odd effects. You look at this and you think, are we looking at vertical searchlights shining into the sky? Because in this particular case, as far as I know, this village doesn't have searchlights shining into the sky. So what is it we're looking at here? For us in the UK, this is very unusual. For a lot of people in a lot of cities, this is just an everyday sight. Whenever you get ice in the atmosphere, doesn't happen that often in the UK, whenever you get ice crystals in the atmosphere, the ice crystals, little hexagonal platelets, will often sit parallel to the ground. They will be horizontal, and each of them is behaving like a little mirror and reflecting lights that are over the horizon. They're just normal street lights, but the street lights are being reflected off these ice crystals which are sitting in the atmosphere tens or hundreds of meters above the ground. And the colors of the light pillars are just reflecting literally the colors of the street lights. Sometimes you can get really wonderful effects here. The street lights are different colors, and so you get the light pillars showing up as different colors. And you can get ice rather higher in the atmosphere, in which case it'll reflect light from even further afield. And if you were to see something like that, again, who wouldn't think there appears to be a city floating in the sky when you see something like that? But if you see it every day of the week, then you wouldn't worry about it because it's a known phenomena. It's only because we're not used to it that we tend to think, wow, I've never seen anything like that before. And again, in this case, it's literally just reflecting the lights that you can see dotted on the horizon here. But there's lots of natural phenomena that we really don't understand particularly well. So-called red sprites. We know that when we have a thunderstorm, there's a thundercloud here which you can't really see. We're familiar with the idea that when you've got a thundercloud, you can get lightning from the cloud to the ground, and sometimes from one cloud to another. Only relatively recently did we realize that it's possible to get lightning on top of the clouds, basically discharging into space rather than discharging to Earth. These so-called red sprites have been reported for quite a few years, but only relatively recently have people had the technology to be able to capture these things. They're very short-lived, relatively faint, not as bright as you would think from this image. But now we know they exist, but we still don't fully understand exactly what's going on. And if you look in detail at what's going on in these red sprites, again, you would be forgiven, if you didn't already know what they were, you'd be forgiven for thinking, whoa, we are being invaded. This is obviously extraterrestrial. We don't understand the structure. It looks like upside down lightning, but why have they got these cones on the end? And what's this blur at the top? All sorts of things we don't understand about red sprites, but as far as we know, they are absolutely natural. They are a phenomenon generated by the extreme conditions above storm clouds. But it's nice to think that if you looked at this, if this image cropped up 50 years ago, there would be no doubt that people would say, definitely aliens. Astronomers would easily deal with this one. If you're not astronomers, maybe you wouldn't jump to the right answer quite so fast. Somebody posted an image, an arc-shaped UFO seen in Canada. Near the end of the day, I was on my deck facing west. Something bright caught my eye. Brilliant white. What are we likely to see as a brilliant point of light in the evening, just about when the sun is setting? I don't know what it is I saw. My conclusion, a UFO. There's the knee-jerk reaction. I don't know what it is, therefore it's a UFO. My friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. If you don't know how far away the object is, how can you possibly work out its size? Some people seem to assume that you can sort of judge it by looking at the size in the sky. But if you don't know distance, there is no way you can judge size. In this case, his friend thinks it's as big as 2 airliners. I thought maybe 1 airliner, but yeah, maybe he's right. But any astronomer who's asked, I've seen something bright just after sunset, bright white in the evening sky, the answer is always Venus. In this particular case, It's arc-shaped because Venus shows phases just like the moon. Venus is much smaller. You usually need binoculars, or in this case, an extreme zoom on a camera to show that there's a crescent phase of Venus, rather blurred because of the extreme magnification here. But again, Venus is responsible for at least half of all UFO sightings that are ever reported. At least half of them are Venus, because some people just don't appreciate how bright it can get. We've looked at man-made objects, we've looked at natural objects. Third category, UFOs could be artifacts. This is a very old image taken in 1952. Mysterious lights were seen over Washington, D.C. People reported seeing this collection of what looks like fireflies here, or more modernly, we might say TIE fighters from Star Wars or something. There seems to be a whole set of them up there. What is it we're actually looking at? I'm not sure if this was debunked back in 1952, but actually it doesn't take that much to figure out what it is that's going on. The camera is looking at this floodlit object, and there's a whole load of lights shining into the camera. Take those lights, turn them upside down, translate them to the top of the picture. What have we actually got? Upside down, because reflections are normally upside down or left, right. They're usually inverted. So bright lights shining into a camera, hopefully the light produces the image, but a small fraction of the light will be reflected off the lenses in the camera, producing lens flare and reflections. And in this case, that's all we're looking at, reflections from these lights shining into the camera. Rather spectacular, or not, depending on context. Again, if you don't know anything about context, it's difficult. The text that was associated with this image was this: the large craft came so close to the photographer that the windows can even be seen. I'm not sure if they mean the pilot is visible and give him a wave there. UFO sighting, this is 100% proof that aliens are here on Earth. You can tell they're genuine because, you know, aliens is in capitals. That's how serious they are. So they must be, if you realize where this image came from, it's actually part of a much bigger image. What are we looking at? A very, very bright object. Probably the full moon, difficult to tell. But if you've got a very bright object shining into the camera, you will get reflections. This is a particularly bad reflection. Perhaps the camera lens was faulty, perhaps it had been chipped. It looks like there's a very odd reflection there. So it's not the sort of reflection you would expect, but given that we're looking at a very bright moon, that is certainly what it is we're seeing here. No, that's not a UFO, that is not the pilot, that is not a window. And you can get much more modern examples of the same thing. I found this on probably Twitter before it became X. This particular individual was taking a picture of this lamp. At the time, they didn't notice there was a UFO in the background. What is this in the sky? It seems to have an aura around it, meaning it seems to have a sort of a glow around it there. And just to show that they wanted an answer, they put hashtag UFO. And to show that they were serious, they put hashtag serious question. In other words, at least they were asking. They said, I don't know what this is. Is it a UFO? Basically, they're asking for other people to say what it is they're looking at. But again, you can see where we're going with this. What's happening? We have a very bright object shining into the camera. The sun is just peeking out from behind this wall through the filigree work of this cast iron lamp stand. And if we look at this UFO in the top there and blow it up a bit, what are we actually seeing? The disk of the sun, well, it's not a full disk because there's a wall here. Remember, this is upside down. It's a reflection of the sun. So it's upside down. So instead of the sun peeking out on the left, the sun appears to be on the right. What are these strange lines? Well, the sun is shining through the iron filigree work of the lampstand. So this is exactly what you would expect if you point the camera at a very bright object. Anybody who says, I've got a picture of a UFO, I don't remember seeing it at the time, 99.999% of the time, that means it wasn't there, and you're just looking at something that is an artifact in the camera. This is perhaps one of my favorites, because this is a huge slab in the sky, what appears to be a flat rectangular aircraft with lights around the edge, hovering in the air. And to give it some credence, they say, well, UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists have claimed it's an advanced type of spycraft known as a TR-3B. Notice how much authority you can give something by just putting a few random letters together. Rather than saying it's a UFO, if you say, I've seen a TR-3B, yeah, a TR-3B. So we're looking at what? From these raindrops, I think we're looking through a windshield on a wet night, somewhere probably in America. And if it's a wet night and we're looking through a windshield, is it possible that this is a large slab in the sky floating there? Or are we looking at the reflection of an iPhone that's sitting on somebody's dashboard? Early versions of iPhones had silver trim around the edge, not so much these days, but the early ones had silver trim. And so again, 99.9%, I think that's an iPhone that's just sitting on the dashboard, caught in the image. And all of the associated text is just twaddle. We've seen man-made UFOs, we've seen natural objects mistaken for UFOs. We've seen image artifacts. It is also possible that UFO images have been faked. Anybody that has to point at it for you to know which is the UFO in the image is clearly struggling to give you a nice UFO image. And if anybody claims that this thing is real, something a mile or two in diameter floating over an interstate, I think if that thing actually appeared, we'd probably know about it. I would imagine a few million people will end up taking a picture of it. Yes, admittedly, it's easy to fake images, but you don't find a million people all faking the same object from different angles. So we would be able to tell if that thing was actually there. I went back over a few older images just to see what we could find out. Here's an image from 1966. It's clearly a digital scan of originally an analog image. Again, we don't have the metadata. I don't know what camera, when it was taken, etc. But here, supposedly, are 3 UFOs floating over this particular area. I looked at the UFOs, and for reference, I looked at this object that's in the foreground. I believe that's the support of a tram line. I'm not too sure, but I believe these are tram lines. And if we compare the fact that the tram lines are absolutely pin sharp, whoever took this picture got it dead right and in focus. But if we look at the UFO, it's rather blurry compared to the very sharp tram lines. In other words, I think what's happened here is somebody who's taken an image, taken a few UFOs, cut and paste them into the image and blurred them to try and make them look realistic. But they've blurred them too much. An object that's actually in the sky would not be that blurred. You might say, well, maybe it's moving. Well, yeah, but if it was moving, it would be blurred in one direction, sharp in the other. So no, that is image fakery. And this is the opposite way around. I know you can't see what's going on here. This is a particularly shocking new footage of an alien ship over Chicago. I thought, what on earth is supposed to be going on there? Only by taking that image and enhancing it could I actually see what was in the image. And that's what's actually in the image. This mottling in the background is perfectly normal whenever you take an image of anything, that even anything that looks perfectly uniform, like these white walls at the side, for instance. Any image will show a certain variation. We call it noise, not audible noise, but video noise or image noise. So this mottling in the background is perfectly normal. And yet the edges of this craft are absolutely razor sharp. This is the opposite problem. If this was real, then it ought to show the same sort of mottling as we get in the background. So this is a cut and paste job where the person doing the cut and paste hasn't got it right. Same sort of idea. These are supposed to be 2 UFOs that are buzzing Air Force One. Air Force One is looking a little blurred and relatively low contrast. Well, that's because it's a long way away. The person taking this photograph might have been, I don't know, a mile away from Air Force One. And there's a lot of air in between you and Air Force One. That air will scatter light, which is why the underside doesn't look black. It just looks a little bit darker than the overside of the aircraft. And yet, the contrast of the UFOs doesn't seem to match. If they are genuinely sitting just behind Air Force One, they wouldn't have the sort of contrast that we can see here. It does not look right for an aircraft that's actually a mile or two away. The air would scatter the light more than indicated in these images. And when it comes to an image like this, the deck of an aircraft carrier with an F-18 jet and a helicopter and, whoa, a triangular UFO, I looked at this and thought, I don't think this is real, but is it possible to actually show that this is not real, rather than just saying that doesn't look right? So again, whenever you have any particular area, like the relatively uniform grey of the deck of this aircraft carrier, I actually picked a strip of grey next door to the F-18, just in between those two white lines, and I looked at how bright is the level of grey. So this graph, vertical scale, is brightness, and the horizontal scale is looking along that line inside the ellipse there. That variation, 70-ish, 71-ish, 69-ish, 71-ish, that variation, that noise is perfectly normal for any image that's taken. You cannot get anything that is perfect. You're bound to get small variations of intensity, not least because the deck itself is not perfectly smooth. But then I said, well, what's going on, let's say, up here, close to this UFO? Let's do the same thing. Well, a little bit of noise, whoa, flat, 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 and then back to noise again. The pixels in this region, in the middle of that ellipse there, they have quite definitely been doctored. It is a cut and paste job, and somebody has smoothed this area and gone overboard. They could, if they were clever enough, have put some noise in there to disguise the fact that they had cut and paste a UFO on the deck of this aircraft carrier. But no, that is quite definitely a doctored image. This one was part of a video. Perhaps you recognize the livery looking out the side window of an EasyJet commercial aircraft when they were buzzed by this UFO that flew by. I looked at that. I'm not much of a video game player, but it didn't take me too long to look at that aircraft and think, I'm sure I've seen that before somewhere. Ah, yeah, it's part of that video game whose name I can't mention for legal reasons, but clearly there's a particular video game in which these aircraft keep appearing, and what they've done is take this particular aircraft or this landing craft and basically cut and paste it into a video of nothing in particular out of their airline window to try and claim that they've seen a UFO flying past. But again, no, not convincing. So yeah, there's plenty of opportunities for AI to generate images that start to look reasonably convincing. At the moment, we can tell whether or not an image has been faked. It won't be that long before AI is so good, it's going to be very difficult to tell a genuine image from an AI faked image. But having talked about man-made objects, natural objects, image artifacts, and fakery, we have to address the fifth possibility, and that is UFOs might be extraterrestrial spacecraft. Now, somebody's done a very good job of documenting them all for us. UFO sighting, set 1, so there must be a set 2 somewhere. This is the first 80 that I could find, 80 UFO models based on actual sightings. So they've catalogued them as A1, A2, A3. Now, who exactly have seen all of these various flying saucers or flying triangles or flying crescents or all sorts of others, I don't know. But some people genuinely believe that these things have buzzed along the Earth and have been seen, though we have no convincing evidence that any of these actually do exist. NASA wrote a report about this a little while ago. They called them Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena, UAPs, rather than UFOs, because UFOs are getting bad press, so they thought they'd change the acronym. NASA had this report. One of the things they said in the opening chapter was, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, the quote from Carl Sagan. They also said that it's tricky if you haven't got the metadata. If the metadata are absent, then a thorough understanding of context is difficult or actually impossible. If you don't know when it was taken, where it was taken, what camera, etc., then the image itself is almost meaningless. And they concluded that there's no evidence for extraterrestrial origin of UAPs. This particular report cost millions. If NASA had come to me a few years ago, I could have told them exactly the same thing. That you really do need extraordinary evidence if you're going to claim they're extraterrestrials. And part of the problem is we do not have the metadata on most of the images that are out there. Now we have digital cameras. In principle, digital cameras are good at recording where and when and who took it on what camera, etc. So maybe the evidence will start accruing over the next few decades. But with the question of extraterrestrials, well, if there's no evidence for any of these UFOs that we've been seeing for decades being extraterrestrial, that leads to a question. We know the number of stars in the Milky Way is something like 300 billion. And most of these 300 billion stars have planetary systems. We didn't know that when I was a kid, but now we know that they do. So there's 150 billion planetary systems out there. And we also know how many of these planets are Earth-like. Again, we didn't know this a few decades ago. We now know that there are something like 50 billion Earth-like planets in our galaxy alone. We really do not know how likely it is that life originated on these planets. Some people say it's inevitable. Some people say it's unlikely. So we've got anything from very unlikely to very likely. So we really don't know. But just for a laugh, let's say that life 99% of the time, even though the conditions might be right, life doesn't get a foothold. So we rule out 99% of those. We're left with 500 billion. If life does get a foothold and start on these planets, let's assume that 99% of the time it goes nowhere. But 1% of the time it develops into complex life. So again, we divide by 100, we're down to 5 million. How often does complex life lead to a civilization, such as we have at the moment? Well, again, we don't know. Let's assume 99% of the time it doesn't. So we divide by 100 again. We're down to perhaps 50,000 Earth-like planets with complex life. If they are out there, why haven't we seen them? Why are none of these UFOs actually extraterrestrial spacecraft? Some people say, well, in principle, life can get a hold and generate life forms many, many, many times over, but civilization doesn't last very long, which is a very sad idea, that civilization only lasts for a few decades or a century or two, and then these civilizations kill themselves, and that's why we're not seeing lots and lots of civilizations throughout the galaxy. We don't need that many. It's not as if we need lots of them. If we had one successful civilization out there that started millions of years ago, they could have colonized the entire galaxy by now. And they would have sent out probes, and maybe we would have seen them flying through our skies. But the bottom line is, we only know of one example where life exists. And that's on that little pale blue dot. That is Earth, photographed from the Voyager spacecraft as it's leaving our solar system. As it's leaving our solar system, it was told to turn around and photograph Earth on its way out of the solar system. And that is it. It's barely a pixel in the image, but that is everything that we know. Carl Sagan said, look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot, 1994. And it's a reminder that regardless of what we think about life elsewhere in the galaxy, at the moment, that is the only example that we know. We're searching on Mars, we're searching on the icy moons of Jupiter to see if there's other signs of life, but so far, we haven't found any. And what I find more unsettling than the idea that we might have been visited by extraterrestrials is the thought that we might be alone. Thank you.